Before we get started, I'm going to need to ask one thing from you, the viewer. Take all the talking points from your favorite Destiny pundit on Twitter or YouTube, all the community discourse, and put it aside for a little. For the small amount of time that I've got your attention, listen closely and let's feel free to have a conversation after. I'm going to start with a simple statement that most of you will agree with. Destiny isn't working for players. But Season 13 might be the key to changing that. To understand why, let's look back a little. Destiny 2 Year 1 launches a reduction of what players had come to expect from Destiny, lighter content in terms of both breadth and depth, leaving players feeling shortchanged. Then Year 2 launched with Forsaken, and everything turned on its head. Players were overwhelmed with content and things to chase. It was a total reversal of what we'd had previously. But I'd also argue that it wasn't a return to the original Destiny Renaissance either, per se. Gone were the days of grinding Crucible for perfect longbow synthesis or Aeris Luna. Not that that's a bad thing, it was just different. The game was generous in every form, from new content to loot, and for the next year that pattern persisted. Shadowkeep and its ensuing seasons launched with a similar approach, albeit without the Activision support studios that had helped to create Year 2's more meaty offerings. Despite some brilliant bright spots, the offerings were lighter and more inconsistent than what players had come to expect over the past year. And now we come to Beyond Light. Now in the third year of this approach, players feel as though without the sheer content volume that made Forsaken in the following years such a hit, the current approach feels hollow. And I think it's finally time to accept a bitter truth. What made Forsaken good was the sheer amount of content they were able to produce on a consistent basis, and without the extra support, that approach is no longer viable. Rail against it, disagree with it, that's the reality, and Bungie said as much. Now, where does Season 13 come into this? Yesterday, the trailer for Season of the Chosen, or Season 13, launched, and it was met with mixed reactions. Some players were hyped, others were uncertain about how much new content they're actually receiving, to which I say, yeah, those are both valid reactions. After letting the trailer and the information doled out over the past few weeks marinate a bit, I finally came to a realization. This is not Destiny as we've known it for the past 3 years. This is not the bombastic season full of new content, not the season of opulence with a massive new activity, raid, and suite of pursuits. This also isn't Undying, Worthy, or even Season of the Hunch, all of which tried to take a similar approach to providing players with novel, meaningful content, but without the quantity to keep players hooked. This is something quieter, more subtle, and, in my opinion, far more impactful. This season is something more akin to Destiny 1 structure, and let's discuss why. First, let's take a look at what's on offer for Season 13. Umbral Engrams are returning to the game, along with the Prismatic Recaster as a permanent addition, allowing players to target farm loot. Trials of Osiris will be receiving a gear refresh, with new weapons and a new set of Trials armor for each class. The Strike playlist will be receiving 3 more strikes, with Fallen Saber and the Devil Slayer returning from the original Destiny, and Proving Grounds is a whole new original strike centered around the seasonal storyline. Each core playlist, Gambit, Crucible, and Strikes, will be receiving 2 new weapons each, only obtainable as end-of-activity rewards. Nightfalls will be receiving 3 exclusive weapons in the form of the Palindrome, Shadow Price, and the Swarm, along with the Depth forms, which can be acquired from Grandmaster difficulty Nightfalls. There will also be new exotic armor for each class, as well as 25 weapons entering the pool, close to the offering available in Beyond Light. Over the course of the season, 20,000 Bright Dust will be available to players, putting Eververse in reach for most hardcore players without ever having to spend any real-world money. And then, new stasis aspects to further the customizability of our Darkness subclasses. There are also the traditional seasonal offerings, a new seasonal activity known as Battlegrounds, a new set of armored weapons tied to said seasonal activity, and an exotic weapon from the Season Pass that's tied to the season's theme. Now, I refer to Season of the Chosen as something quieter and more subtle. It is not difficult to see why. The amount of new seasonal content, whether that be activities or seasonal loot, isn't that high, and the roadmap confirms this. Much of the new content we'll be receiving this season focuses on battlegrounds. It's no surprise why players aren't feeling as hyped. But when we look at improvements made to the existing core parts of the game, it's a different story. New strikes and incentives to engage with Nightfalls make time spent in the activity feel worthwhile relative to other options. A full gear refresh for Trials gives lapsed and ongoing players a reason to duke it out in the playlist, hopefully pulling up the player population. Playlist-specific weapons give players an old-school AS Luna-style loot pursuit if they feel like chilling and grinding those core activities. And target farming with Umbrals takes a loot system that far too often feels like playing a slot machine and turns that system into one that makes it a point to respect player time. If you remember what I said earlier, I mentioned that Season of the Chosen represents a pivot towards a different style for Destiny, and will serve to be a more important release than any of us quite realize. For those of you who played Destiny 1, think about what kept you hooked. Obviously the gameplay, no doubt about that. But also, coming back to the Crucible playlist again and again for the chance at a better AS Luna to leverage against your foes in the Crucible. Grinding out Nightfalls for the chance at weapons like Grasp of Malik and Imago Loop. Running Trials every weekend to get these gorgeous flawless ornaments and seek out depth versions of your favorite Trials weapons. And running the weekly featured raid week in and week out to get stunning new raid armor and enhanced versions of old beloved raid weapons. Destiny wasn't a game that kept you playing with a wealth of new content every week, it kept you playing with its depth, and a reason to visit existing content time after time. So now I'm gonna hit you all with another hard-to-hear assertion. Forsaken was bad for Destiny. Don't get me wrong, it was a fantastic expansion and introduced so many amazing additions to the game, and that year was some of the most heavy, engaging content we've received at any point in the series' history. But it lived and died by the measure of quantity. While all 3 seasons featured major updates to the game, Season of the Drifter was maligned for what was viewed as a meager offering relative to Season of the Forge before it, and Season of Opulence, which followed. While I'd also agree that in terms of interesting, meaningful improvements, it wasn't as strong as Forge or Opulence, the philosophy of content mass correlating with the season's quality continues to linger. Radiant and Dying were both criticized for being shallow offerings relative to what had come before, and even Dawn received the same feedback, aside from the Court of Time to phenomenal new story missions and target farming that was relatively new to Destiny. Those same grievances continued with the recent Season of the Hunt, with players applauding the quality of what was on offer, but being put off by the lack of quantity. Forsaken shifts Destiny's focus from keeping players coming back to handcrafted experiences again and again in pursuit of a goal, to making as many of those experiences possible to give players something new to constantly sink their teeth into. It's a different approach to building out an MMO, and while Bungie had the support of Vicarious Visions and High Moon, that was perfectly viable. Obviously, no one was able to predict that within a year they'd be separating from Activision and losing a lot of the manpower at their disposal, but that's what we're looking at with today's Destiny. And so, it's finally time for us to let go of Forsaken, and look for Destiny to take a new direction, one that incorporates the original Destiny's philosophy of depth over breadth, while continuing to keep with the evolving nature and flow of new ideas and activities introduced with Forsaken. And so, we enter Season of the Chosen. This is uncharted territory for Destiny 2. Assuming that the majority of the coming season's content isn't hidden away waiting for Bungie to reveal it as a surprise, which is almost definitely not the case, we're faced with a new type of season. One that doesn't seek to emulate past hits in Season of Opulence or Season of Rivals, but makes foundational improvements that give players a reason to engage with the wealth of content that's already on offer. Improvements that give players a reason to spend the day in the Crucible or in Strikes, hoping to finally get a god roll in what might be the next Ayasuna, or aim for mastery in Trials or GMs in pursuit of gorgeous original armor, or even more lethal adept weapons. And I know what you're saying. This is a limited slate of improvements, and it doesn't fix core issues with the Crucible or with having little reason to play Gambit, or raids feeling tedious to return to, and I agree with you. But let's say Season of the Chosen's approach succeeds, that players give it a fair shake, and in turn Destiny pivots its focus from creating the shiniest, newest experience to deepening the game across the board. Then what's to stop next season from shifting its sights from Strikes to Crucible? From taking the time and resources that would formerly be placed into activities that most players only interact with a handful of times, and investing it into a suite of new Crucible maps and modes? From following it up with the season that takes a look at how we handle raids, adding more incentive via new difficulty options, a targeted loot system, and updated caps that keep players' old, faithful raid weapons from falling into obscurity. What Season of the Chosen offers is a chance for us to finally break free from the model that was set up in Forsaken. The model that, while refreshing and amazing at the time, no longer works for players or the studio. This is why Season of the Chosen is the most impactful season we've seen in years. This is Destiny's chance to change its, well, destiny. It's no surprise that players are mixed in their feelings about Season of the Chosen, and it's not just because many players feel burnt out after this past season, it's because this is something new and uncertain, something that doesn't offer much in the way of what we've come to expect. But if it lands correctly, especially if players take the good with the bad, and end up finding value in a renewed focus on the game's core, we could be looking at a very different Destiny over the next few years. One that combines the brightest additions over G2's lifecycle with not only the content of its predecessor, but the philosophy behind it, to build a unified, better Destiny. This has been Hoplite, and I'll see you next time.